Good morning and welcome to the 24th meeting of the Local Government and Communities Committee in 2019, and can I remind everyone present to turn off their mobile phones. The first agenda, the committee is invited to consider and agree whether to take agenda items 3 and 4 in private. Item 3 is consideration of evidence heard today in relation to the committee's pre-budget scrutiny, and item 4 is consideration of the Stage 1 report on non-domestic rates. Are we all agreed? Thank you. That is agreed. The agenda item 2, the committee will take evidence today from representatives from the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations, Unison Scotland and the Robertson Trust in relation to its pre-budget scrutiny and long-term financial sustainability of local government. The purpose of this session is to help inform a letter we will be writing to the Scottish Government later in the autumn, suggesting issues to prioritise in next year's budget. The committee also has a more general and long-term interest in the future of local government funding and financing. And I welcome David McNeill, Director of Development, SCVO, Mary Quigley, Member of Unison Scotland Local Government Committee, and Kenneth Ferguson, Director of the Robertson Trust. And I thank you all for your written submissions. And we'll go straight on to questions from members, and I'll start off with Sarah Boyack.
Thank you very much, Convener. It's really a question for the whole panel, and I'm just going to ask some introductory questions about the levels of expenditure and pressures in local government, and just to get you to give us your take on the impact of budget levels on council services as a whole, given the budget pressures that there are.
From our point of view, we know that council budgets have been cut drastically over the last 10 years or so. It's had a massive impact on the staff that work there and on the services that they provide. There's also a growing, we think, crisis in terms of experience and skills in local authorities. A lot of people have, over the last 10 years, I would say, probably thinking 1 in 7 local authority workers have left employment since the beginning of austerity. So we are experiencing a situation where people who are aged enough, are old enough to withdraw their pensions and have been offered voluntary redundancy from organisations have left. So there's an experience gap, experience brain drain, we would say, from people leaving local authorities. And that's as a result directly of the cuts. They've been called efficiency savings from the beginning, and I think we call them cuts because efficiency savings sounds like a positive thing. From our point of view, there's if all the efficiencies that kind of been taken out of local government have been taken, and there's nothing left to be efficient, to be saved there. We are, I would say, at the point where services are being severely affected. Anything that's not an essential service in terms of legislation is at risk of cut. And all the people that I speak to, all our members in local government, really feel like that the cuts have had a massive impact on both their workplace, their workload, and mostly that they're concerned about is the effect on the services that they deliver.
Okay, thanks. The other two witnesses have an overall comment.
Yeah, I suppose we're all aware of the challenges to public sector finances, and the third sector has experienced the knock-on effects of that. I think our latest evidence showed that funding has been cut to around 1.8 billion, down from 1.9 billion since 2010, and that's a real terms cut of around 20%. And the public sector funding is crucial to the third sector. It accounts to around a third of its overall income, half of which is directly through local authorities, a large majority related to social care and other things. And I think the sector appreciate the challenges of finance, the need to deliver efficiency savings, and there's not a large unending amount of money to go around. I think the sector has dealt very well with the challenges around cuts and efficiency savings, freezes, but there's a sense now that there is a real crunch now, and while there may be a kind of progression in the public sector around wage increases, that those the third sector has not been able to match that because the funding has been frozen or cut. So the sector is facing real challenges as a result of that overall local government financial settlement. I think more generally, though, it's not about the total amount of money that's into the sector. It's about the processes and how local government and the wider public sector deal with the sector in terms of awarding contracts, procurement and commissioning. And those would be the issues that are pretty critical rather than the total amount of funding.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to comment at all on this one?
Yes, thank you. As a charitable funder, we see a lot of charity accounts. We see probably about 1,000 Scottish charities each year seeing their accounts. And it's been very clear since 2008 that the charity sector in Scotland has tried to cope, and it has coped very well actually, with some of the challenges that have been put to it in terms of funding and in terms of grants, because there's two aspects to it. There's the contract part, which a lot of charities are involved with local authorities, but there's also the grant side of it. And they've seen cuts and a tightening on both of those. And what we've seen is since 2008, there's been, within the charities, they've coped with it by being much leaner and trying to cope and cut their cloth accordingly, and they've really cut it back to the bone. The other thing that we've seen more recently is now they've started to use up the reserves, and we're seeing more and more charities now actually on the verge of insolvency. A lot of charities have now squeezed as hard as they can in terms of their efficiency, used up the reserves, and are still facing cuts coming through. So the situation is becoming increasingly difficult for charities. On top of that, we see other trends such as the local government pension scheme, which a lot of the charities are forced or have been forced to be part of, and now are sitting with a situation where it's too expensive to be in and too expensive to come out. And this is causing problems for charities, and some of the recent charity failures, the final salary pension schemes have been a contributory factor to that. So it's a very difficult situation for charities in Scotland at the moment.
Yeah, I think that comes across very well from all three of you. That statistic I think you gave us of a 20% cut in real terms over 9 years is quite stark. In terms of specific service areas that have seen cuts in spending, are there areas you'd want to highlight? I think somebody mentioned things that you have to spend money on in local authorities: education, social care. So what's missing out in the process? You've all talked about pressures.
So one of the things that we see is the effect of ring fencing on budgets and on local authorities. So, for example, in education, if the spend on teachers is ring fenced, then everything else in that department is vulnerable to cuts. So, whilst you're protecting teacher numbers, the effect of that is then to put classroom assistants, special needs assistants, technicians, other support workers in schools and in the wider sort of education departments across the country. Those jobs are vulnerable, and those are the ones that we see that are reconfigured time and again, that are salami sliced year on year. So you're not getting there's not a big headline saying, you know, such and such an authority has withdrawn all of its classroom assistant support, because that happens on a yearly basis. So in a lot of places, support in schools is down to the bone. Whilst the teacher numbers are protected, the councils don't have the autonomy on the ground to distribute the resources the way that they see fit. So in education, it's caused a massive problem.
Thanks for that. I'm thinking about third sector, Robertson Trust. You've sometimes filling the gaps where services have gone, other times you're doing contracts. Have you got a perspective here?
Yes, I would say that the sector has been very badly affected by it because, not to over-dramatise it, it feels as if a lot of the time that the redundancies have been outsourced into the third sector. Because of this ring fencing, a lot of the local authority budgets have been protected, and therefore the bit that has left to get the savings out of is the third sector. And that has been seen disproportionate amounts of cuts coming through. 20% in cuts and budgets is not uncommon. And we've certainly seen a lot of that over the last few years. As funders, we're obviously very concerned, and I speak also on behalf of the Scottish Grantmakers, which is, we represent 50 grantmakers within Scotland, and we all are seeing the same thing, that the tide of public spending is retreating, and it's leaving vulnerable people on the beach. And as funders, what do? We wouldn't normally be funding a lot of the services that are left exposed. but as funders, we're seeing that there's a role for us to get involved and perhaps to pick up some of that. And this is moving us into new territory. And it's all as a result of the tightening of finances within local authorities and that disproportionate magnifying effect on the third sector of any cuts.
Yep.
I'd strongly echo Kenneth's comments there. I think the tightening of budgets has resulted in statutory services and the statutory requirements being the priority for local authorities, and that's pushed out any kind of real focus on doing early intervention or prevention and that upstream work that's needed. I know in Shelter Scotland's response to this committee, they talked about the extent to which homelessness provision is statutory and that has had some degree of protection, but all the prevention work that gets there that'll stem that tide in the future, that work is suffering because of the cuts to funding.
Anticipated my next question, which was about the impact on preventative spend. So can I push that back to the other two witnesses? It's something that came up quite strongly last week in terms of the Christie Commission, the idea of early intervention. Have you got a perspective from Unison or Robertson Trust on preventative spend issues?
Thank you. One of the things that we see is that preventative spend seems to be, for local authorities, is, I'm not going to say an easy place, but it's an obvious place to, because of the levels of cuts that we're at, to make savings in. So, for example, there's long-term preventative spend like reducing alcohol consumption and the provision of expanded early years provision is all very well and good, but there is short-term preventative spend that is no longer happening in a lot of places. That so things like road gritting, which prevents trips and falls and costs to the NHS. Youth work has been massively hit, and you get immediate impact with youth work in terms of preventative, in terms of antisocial behaviour, positive destinations for young people. Youth work is definitely something that has been sacrificed, maybe too much a word, but an easy hit, and I think you probably, for your experience, agree with that. It's not something that's garners a lot of attention in the press. It's not something that a lot of people would understand enough, I think, really, to see what the immediate impact of cutting services like that. The same with family learning and adult community education, services like that, which are immediately preventative and stop us storing up problems for the future. They've all been decimated.
Thanks for that.
I would just absolutely concur with that. I think you see some of that down in London, where there's been huge cuts. I mean, as you know, England has suffered much deeper cuts than Scotland. And as a funder, we see that, my fellow funders down in London, where there's been the funding cuts to things like youth provision. And part of the reason for the rise in knife crime is the fact that there is no youth clubs. There is nowhere for young people to go. And I mean, that's part of the impact of cuts. And yes, I would just concur with that. In terms of preventative spend, the late Colin Mayer said to a meeting of the grant makers, he said, you are the research and development for the public sector. He said, because there is no money in the public sector now. There is no ability to do these great preventative things that the third sector is so able to bring forward. There's no ability to bring that forward. And I think that's our experience, is that there's lots of really good things within charities and within the third sector in terms of that preventative spend and innovation. And there's no ability for it to be brought into local authority and into the actual services that local authorities are doing, because they're being clamped down so tight in terms of finance. There's no ability to move to that. And we're not seeing much initiative coming from local authorities to say, let's now see if we can try and move towards the preventative. Because as you know, what you've got is you've got to keep going with the high cost reactive services at the same time as trying to bring forward your preventative. So you've got to have that, somehow you've got to have extra money in the system to allow that to happen. And that's obviously part of our driver, which hopefully we'll come on to later, about our social bridging finance, about providing that bridging across from the high cost to going to that lower cost preventative model.
Yeah. Thanks very much. And I think the evidence I think Unison gave was about the balancing of reduction in terms of money while you've got increased service demand in certain areas. So pretty challenging. Just a final word on that?
Sorry, yeah, I think what we're seeing is an increase in demand across the board for services in local authorities, and that's mostly coming from service users that are in the lowest income groups. So, well, we've had wage freezes and for 10 years now or more, the demand in services is disproportionately coming from lower income families and households. And cuts disproportionately affect lower income service users as well. And we count some of our members in that category, unfortunately, too. There's a lot of our members have part-time, small numbers of hours contracts, so they fall into that category as well. So they're, whilst being service providers, they're also service users, so they're getting a double dint. So they're getting a wage freeze, and I know that that's been made some progress on that this year, but it doesn't make up for the lost wages of the last few years. So there's a double whammy there for people who are low waged working in local authority. A lot of the times the services that they rely on are being cut back as well.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. I'm going to let Graham in and then Kenny, but just before, can we just clarify then, there is no wage freeze now?
Yes, sorry, the effect of the wage freeze.
But I mean, your members would have received a wage rise.
Yes, that's correct. But what I suppose my point is that the wage rise, the wage freeze, the wages have been unfrozen, but that hasn't the cumulative effect of the wage freeze up until this point is still evident for people. People's wages are still a lot lower than they would have been had there not been a wage freeze.
Which would be the same across many areas of
I
society.
don't deny that. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Graham.
Yeah, thanks very much, convener. I just want to move this on a bit from sort of you saying there's not enough money in the system, and perhaps some of us can accept that. But what is the solution? I mean, I notice in the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations written submission to the committee, right at the end, you give us some examples of successful sort of projects in various councils, and your conclusion is there are better ways of working, and you say money is not always what's required. So if that is the case, then perhaps you could expand on that. Perhaps you could all reflect on that. Is money always the answer? Are there better ways of doing things? Because I mean, it's very easy for councils just to continue doing things the way they've always done, but to actually be quite dramatic about things and change is perhaps difficult for them.
I think in terms of the better ways of working, there's a lot around procurement and commissioning, and the kind of failure of the market model. And I don't think that's necessarily about legislation. It's about practice, a risk-averse culture in local authorities and the wider public sector, and the processes that have moved us away from kind of relationship-based funding to contracts. I think the evidence shows that in 2004, 18% of the sector's public sector funding was contracts, and it's now 70%. So we've moved away from grants to contracts, to service level agreements, and the evidence, I think, shows that this is very much based on efficiency savings first. So there's nothing wrong with procurement on its own, but I think a lot of the practice has been driven by reducing the costs and delivering efficiency savings, not considering the design of services and how to make them better. There's other models. There's market facilitation, bringing people together, bringing communities together to design what services they need. There's examples in the briefing, such as in East Ayrshire's Youth Work Service, but creating 5 hubs. Some of them delivered by the public sector, some of them delivered by the third sector, and that was based on existing organisations and shaping what they do, and as a result of conversations, not of creating a procurement specification for 5 things that need to be delivered and putting that out to tender. So I think more conversations, more collaboration, more co-production in a local community is pretty crucial. And some people and some areas are good at that. Others are delivered by the strict rules and guidance or their interpretation of procurement legislation and being risk averse.
Yeah, I would concur with that. And I think that what we've seen within the third sector, that drive towards a contract approach, has been kind of almost a supermarket type relationship where it's master-servant. And there is an imbalance in power, a huge imbalance in power, as you can imagine, between local authorities and often quite small charities. And that feels wrong, but there has been very much an emphasis on that, and that has really been pushed hard. The other thing which happens, which I think a lot of people will be quite shocked about, is the fact that local authorities demand complete transparency of accounts. That wouldn't happen in a supermarket with a supplier. They would be able to keep their margins to themselves, but that doesn't happen in the third sector with local authorities. They demand to see if you're making any kind of surplus whatsoever, and it's often clawed back. And as a result, it doesn't lead to long-term sustainability, and it doesn't lead to a partnership type approach. And to develop David's idea, yes, absolutely, there needs to be a shift from this master-servant to one where there's a parity of esteem. I was very encouraged by public social partnerships. I think they were a really useful addition to the landscape, a different approach to developing services. They have their weaknesses, which we highlighted in our submission, but I think that that's a really useful change in lens of looking between the local authority and the charity, because it's actually saying, well, how can we do this together? How is this a partnership? And how can we do things to play to each other's strengths rather than to have this where I've got a big stick and I will try and hit you as hard as I can with it to get the lowest price. The other thing about it is that master-servant relationship is a race to the bottom, because it's just about driving down cost. And that's the fundamental discussion. And it's not about service, and it's not about the quality of what's actually delivered. And that's what I think the third sector really prides itself on, is that ability to bring a real quality and a depth of relationship to beneficiaries. And I think that it completely promotes the wrong values within the sector when it's just a focus on money. So money isn't everything, I agree, but it's a very important part of it. But also there are definitely different ways of doing it.
Before you come in, Marie, I think it's really interesting, but I'm just wondering how you change that. If the money is coming from the councils, they're the ones that are procuring the services, so they're going to demand certain things.
I think it's about how they look at those, and I think it's about how they look at it going forward. I think that there's not enough of a long-term look within local authorities. And dare I say it, and it comes back to Marie's point, her comment about salami slicing. They're not being strategic in terms of actually who should be our partners going forward, who should we work with, rather than just saying, here's the third sector, we'll apply a 20% cut across all the providers in this. It'd be far better to say, actually, these are the ones who are creating the right outcomes. Rather than looking at inputs, they should be looking at outcomes and in terms of quality of what that provider is actually providing.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good point, Kenneth, and it's one of the things that is an issue when we speak to local authorities, is this ability to be strategic, to plan long term. And, you know, successive years of one-year budgets have made that almost impossible. Also, in your question, you know, you referred to change being difficult for local authorities, and I think that's possibly a little bit unfair. I think they've had to deal with massive changes over the last few years and have all done it differently, and salami slicing is one of the effects. But, you know, there's a lot of... I was really interested in what you said about the master-servant relationship, because it feels a bit like that in local government in terms of things that have to be delivered for central government and you know, the effect of ring fencing and things like that. So there's definitely an echo there, I would say, and that is having an effect on a relationship with communities, a relationship with third sector organisations. One of the ideas that have been mooted over the last few years and things that have been seen as a way of cutting costs and creating efficiencies are things like regional collaboratives and shared services. In our view and in our experience, that these are hugely expensive to set up and don't actually produce much in the way of savings. And the effect really is that you're taking control away from local people of their services. It's a one-size-fits-all approach, and I'm sure you'll recognise that. And whilst we talk on the one hand about involving communities in distribution of resources and managing services through things like participatory budgeting, on the other hand, if we're looking at shared services and regional collaboratives, the two things don't necessarily work together. So we recognise very much what you're saying there about the effect not breakdown, but the difficulty in relationship between communities, third sector organisations and local authorities is having on the service users on the ground and on the most vulnerable. I would think they were all working with, either as providers of service in a local authority or as providers of service within the voluntary sector.
Thank you.
Can I just clarify then, what services do you think, I mean, you call them ring fence, but most of them I think are core, accepted as core services. Which core services do you not think should be core services and should be left to the whims of each individual council?
That's a bit of a pejorative word, I think, whims. It's not about whims, it's about the needs of the community.
But which ones then do you think that should be left to the local authority to decide if they're core or not?
Well, I think really that should be up to each local authority and the needs of the community within the communities within that.
So you don't think there should be core services then?
I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is the core services are bleeding the resources from the rest of the services, and depending on your point of view and depending on what services you use, you're going to have a different view on what are core services. So, for example, things like street cleaning and grass cutting. To a lot of people out there that you'll speak to in surgeries and places like that, those are core services to them. They're not to legislatively, but they have massive effects in communities. If you're not cutting grass or cleaning
Are you telling me you think that they sit on a par with education?
I'm not saying that. I'm saying they're equally important depending on the point of your own point of view. If you've got rats in your back lane but you don't have kids at school, you're going to have a different point of view. I'm not saying education is not as, I'm not saying that street cleaning is more important than education from a societal point of view, but from a service user point of view, it's all important.
The council does have a responsibility for the society that it represents.
Absolutely.
The local representative and others have a responsibility to assist the individual in every case, and which I completely agree. For the individual, then whatever faces them is the important thing. The council does have a different responsibility.
Good morning, panel. Just in the unison submission in paragraph 11, it says that we believe that the Parliament needs to devolve further powers to communities. I'm just wondering if you can elaborate on which powers should be devolved.
I think, just as I said in my response to the earlier question, when you take away decisions on what is core funding and what is ring fenced from the Scottish Government, and projects that are part funded, like the expansion of early years, what it does is it takes the spotlight away and it takes the resources away from other things that local communities might find more important. For example, like transport infrastructure. Sorry, were you?
Sorry, I just want a piece of clarification. When you say local communities, do you mean local authorities?
No, I mean local communities.
Right, because I thought for a minute that you were talking about local authorities, and I wondered if we were talking at cross purposes.
Local authorities are the conduit to local communities. It's
Indeed.
all connected. Local authorities are the bodies that connect people in communities. They connect voluntary organisations. They connect service users of our own services and other bodies like NHS, etc. So there's an important societal role there for local authorities, and in terms of if you're looking at saving money and not making expensive mistakes, if you're supplying services for communities, the best place to start is to ask the communities what they need. And I think that's what we're referring to. So if you're having dialogue within communities, you're having proper local leadership and ownership of things, then that's a way to save money in the way that we look at it, because you're not providing services that people aren't going to uptake and aren't going to need.
Saying is that the local authority itself should be devolving services down to community level. Right, okay, that's fine for clarification. Now, in terms of the other parts of your submission, you've said in paragraph 12, since 2007 there have been 2 substantial inquiries into replacement for the council tax and a consultation on a local income tax. And then you go on to say in paragraph 16, a replacement for the council tax is not enough. There needs to be a much wider basket of taxes and income-raising routes for local authorities. And the power to introduce taxes must lie with local authorities. So I'm just wondering what this wider basket of taxes and income-raising routes is, because there doesn't seem to be any specifics as to what they are and how much they would raise and for local government, and what the impact would be on the public, the people who would be obviously paying for that. Because if you're going to be raising additional new taxes, I imagine that there'll be a number of people who will actually have to pay for that. So I'm just wondering if you can give us a wee bit more detail on that.
So, not being a tax expert, can't give you much more detail, but one of the things that's been spoken about, for example, is the transient visitors tax, which some local authorities would find useful in terms of raising cash. There's been other taxes, behavioural taxes, such as the paper cup tax and the parking tax and things like that. We see them just as, I mean, they're useful, but they're very small in terms of the impact that they could have. And they're also behavioural taxes as well. They're about persuading people to take a different path, to not use a paper cup, like Boris Johnson yesterday. So there's also one of the things that we've spoke about on many occasions is the transfer of the non-domestic rates back to local authority control as well. So to use that as an economic lever, amongst other things. The impact on taxpayers, I'm sorry I can't answer that. That's something I suspect you would need to speak to somebody a lot more experienced than myself.
I don't want it just to be about me asking you questions. I'd like other panel members to comment a wee second. But on non-domestic rates, I mean, obviously there's an issue. I represent North Ayrshire. A lot of people in North Ayrshire obviously spend their money in places like Braehead, for example, or Glasgow city centre. So if you have non-domestic rates, that would surely reduce the amount of money available to North Ayrshire, but increase the money available to Glasgow. So surely all that would happen there if you returned the rates to local authorities would be that you would just have to change the distribution model in order that local authorities such as North Lanarkshire, whatever, Clackmannanshire weren't disadvantaged, for example, compared to Edinburgh, Glasgow, Aberdeen.
I think you're probably right, and I think, and that's why it has to be part of a wider review of the funding arrangements for local government. Local government needs more money coming directly from government, but it also needs the ability to raise its own money, and a replacement for the council tax would be a good start. The control of non-domestic rates is part of that as well, but we don't see that as the be-all and end-all. All of these things are not going to answer the main question, the problem that local authorities just don't have enough money to deliver the services that are needed. So,
okay, I think that's an important point you've made. Local authorities don't have enough money to deliver the services that are needed. So how much money, given that we are going to produce a report which will make recommendations to Scottish ministers to help inform the 2020-21 budget, how much additional funding should be provided to local authorities this year? And given the fact that, for example, 43% of the Scottish budget is dedicated to health, how should that be? Where should the money for that come from? Should it be additional taxation? Should it be from other areas of the Scottish budget? So how much more, and who should pay for it, and how should it be funded, basically? Because we've got to make recommendations on that. So anything, and I'll be asking the other members of the panel that as well. So we think it's not just about unison.
I think it's clear that local authorities have been disproportionately affected by the reduction in funding over the last few years in comparison to every other area of funding that the Scottish Government has. And an example of the authority that I work in, you're asking how much more funding over the next 3 years is facing a likely cut of between £100 and £130 million. That's going to have a devastating impact on the services that it delivers on and on the people that work there. And so there's a that's, I don't have the figure for the whole of Scotland, but that's a starter for 10. I would say that's the sort of gap that there's going to be over the next 3 years in one authority. It's North Lanarkshire.
And but how should that be funded? Because it's easy to say we should give a local authority X, Y, Z, but how do we actually pay for it? Is a $64,000 or £130 million question in terms of North Lanarkshire?
Yeah, and I think probably people who are better paid than I are the ones that are able to answer that. But what our point is that it seems to have been the distribution of resources so far seems to have definitely has disproportionately affected local authorities. So a rebalancing of that would go a long way. Looking at how local taxes, in particular, a replacement for the council tax, it is another way, another thing that we're calling for. I suppose I don't have an answer for you in terms of who should pay for that. I think we should collectively pay for that, but how that's organised.
Mr. McNeill, local government's been disadvantaged. In 1999, local government, NHS had about 36% of the Scottish Government budget. It's now 43%. It's projected over the next years to go up to 50%. So how can we rebalance and help local government? How can we achieve what I think everyone in this committee wants to see, which is to have local government to have more resources? How do you feel we could try and square that circle?
I think that's a difficult one to answer based on kind of the evidence that we have. I mean, I think we kind of know the pressures that kind of statutory services and things like education and health that are absolutely critical and need to be funded, and with that results in pressures on other services. And it comes back to that earlier point about preventative spend. What's getting squeezed is the prevention that will stem that tide. In the past, and I know former Chief Medical Officer Harry Burns talked a lot about this, that you can't expect early intervention to be achieved by spending the same amount of money. You need to double invest for a period to reduce that future burden. So that requires more money. Where does that more money come from? There is issues around tax reform, and we've not. We're not tax experts at all. We don't have a particular position on tax. Our members have a very kind of diverse range of views. Things that we've said in the past around principles, really around kind of three things about the ability to pay should be considered. Often the third sector is supporting kind of the most vulnerable, those that can't pay, and proportionately have a potentially higher tax bill, and there's very real consequences for them around affording basic goods such as food, fuel, housing. So yeah.
Say that there is preventive spend already obviously taking place. I mean, the rolling out of family nurse partnerships, for example, in recent years, the fact that we're going up to 1,140 hours of free childcare for vulnerable 2-year-olds, 3- and 4-year-olds next year is going to have a big impact, we hope, of course, over a number of years before it will be, all the benefits will be fully realised. But that is happening. The issue, of course, is how we disinvest. The Scottish Government did put £500 million in over 3 years after the 2011 election, but it was easy enough to get people to invest in these preventive spend if it was getting additional money from Scottish Government. But to try and get them to disinvest from areas of spend which perhaps were not delivering as effectively as they should and switching to others was very, very difficult.
And that comes down to, I think, one of the principles around transparency, around decision making, how things are made. It's we've talked about salami slicing and cutting budgets, but actually conversations should be around local priorities, the engagement of the community, being clear on the areas, topics, themes that we're choosing to disinvest in and why, and where we are choosing to invest, rather than just a decision to cut a budget or cut everybody's budgets down. And that seems to be the experience just now. It's based on a financial decision rather than transparency around what is the best service or the priority that's needed. That's, I think, that kind of transparency and engagement process with the third sector, with communities, is the bit that's perhaps missing.
Sir Ferguson, I know Ms Quigley said earlier on at the beginning of the session that there's nothing to be saved because of efficiencies. The Accounts Commission have raised issues about there being widely differing costs to deliver almost the same service, even when you account for deprivation and rurality, for example. Do you feel that there's more efficiencies to be made in the system, and where, and what change do you feel we can do to deliver the most sustainable and best possible local government, given the financial constraints we will have? Because even if we have additional funding for local government, well, there's never going to be as much as we would want to see.
I think we are ignoring one of the greatest assets we've got, which is our third sector, and the passion and the innovation that's in there. I think that that preventative spend that David spoke about, absolutely, it's there in bucket loads in the sector, and it's not being given a chance to come forward. And the other thing that's not happening, and it's something that causes us great angst, is the scalability. We see lots and lots of great examples of really good things that are done on a preventative way, but they're all small. And it's how do you get those scaled from that small thing up to something that has got national significance. And I could spend the rest of the day giving examples of third sector organisations that are doing fabulous work in our communities, preventing spend further downstream that would be astronomical, but we're not getting them scaled. We're not delivering that on a national basis.
Do you feel that should be enhancing local government services or replacing local government services? Where do you feel it should tie in?
It'll be a mixture of both,
right?
Because that's the way. It's about additionality.
Yeah.
And certainly that's the way we see the sector, is it's not trying to replace one with the other. It's actually saying this is an additional service that they can provide. They can provide it in different ways. And
so,
they can...
Sorry. I don't like to keep interrupting. I realise there's time limited and other members want to come in. But so should SCVO not be looking at the, and I'm sure you are, but I mean, should you not be at projects that are delivering, exceptionally well across the country, say in Murray or in East Lothian or whatever, and suggesting that they be rolled out in Glasgow, Edinburgh, across the country, whatever? What dialogue are you having with ministers in terms of these kind of initiatives that are successful in delivering?
I think there's a huge amount of work we do to share good practice and what the sector are doing. I think that challenge around scale isn't just about things that work in East Lothian don't necessarily work in Glasgow, that are not appropriate for Highland. So local solutions are probably most important. I think the challenge, including what Kenneth and the Robertson Trust referred to in their submission, is around that there does tend to be short-term, it's the short-term pots of money that go in to develop things, to do things, and then that money is removed, reducing their sustainability and their ability to scale or move or replicate and learn. The sector is very willing to learn from each other. And what happens is kind of short-term projects, programmes disappear, and that good work is lost because innovation sometimes is prioritised over what works.
Lastly, do you have any views on non-domestic rates, being returned to local authorities, or any additional taxes that should be made available to local authorities, Mr McNeill or Mr Ferguson?
We wouldn't make a comment on that.
Okay. That's fine. Thank you very much, Convener.
Andy, you wanted to come in?
Thanks very much, Convener, and thanks, panel, for coming in. I want to start, Mr Ferguson, just by looking at your evidence about the SBF, Social Bridging Finance, yes. Just a bit of clarity. You talk about 5 stages to the model. 2's the binding contract for a specified period. Then there's demonstration, usually 2 to 3 years, then evaluation. Then you talk about sustainability. If the evaluation concludes that the success criteria have been met, the contract determines the length of time for which the public sector agency will sustain funding for the service. Does that mean, therefore, that you demonstrate it for, let's say, 2 years, but in the contract is a commitment, if the valuation is successful, it will continue for a further 5, for example?
Exactly that.
So what are those kind of timescales beyond the demonstration that typically these projects are being committed for?
Usually under 5 years.
Okay.
But in that sort of 2 to 5 year commitments that they're making.
And is that 2 to 5 years, I mean, is that designed to embed permanent change in the way a service is delivered in the local authority?
It can be. It depends if it's being scaled or whether it's actually just being sustained for the particular service there. or whether it's actually going right across the whole of the local authority. It depends on the project that they're actually looking at.
So can you give us some examples of ones?
I can give you some great examples. You may be aware of MCR Pathways in Glasgow, fantastic charity that started work, and it's an adult mentor for young people in the care system, and they work in the schools. And they started off in 6 schools, started off in 1 school in Glasgow and built it to 6 in the north, and it was having fantastic educational outcomes for these young people. And MCR came to us and said, look, we've got the potential to work with Glasgow City Council to roll this out to 12, and if the outcomes, the educational outcomes are met for these young people, Maureen McKenna, the Director of Education at Glasgow, has said that she will roll it from the 12 out to 29 schools, all 29 schools in Glasgow, and she'll sustain it for 5 years. And so that was the model that we used, and we put £1 million in for a 3-year trial period, and that £1 million was to effectively take it from 6 schools to 12 schools, and at the end of that there would be an independent evaluation of the educational outcomes of the young people. And after 18 months, Maureen McKenna came and said, I want to stop the trial. And the reason being that it has exceeded their expectations, and she said, it'd be remiss of me to continue with this trial and not roll it out to all 29 schools. And what they did was they rolled it to 29 schools, and she said, I'm not going to sustain it for 5 years. I'm actually going to change my systems and embed this now as business as usual. So what we saw was an amazing change for the young people in the care system in terms of their educational outcomes, and some of the best practice then being embedded in the educational system in Glasgow. And Maureen said that without that ability to run 2 systems at the one time, and I referred to that earlier, about where you've got to keep going with your current systems, but you want to bring in the new things. And what we did was we provided that risk money to do that. And of course, the beauty of this contract is that if it hadn't met those outcomes, that Glasgow would have been able to walk away with absolutely no impact on the public purse. All the risk was borne by the philanthropic funders within our model. So that's the beauty of it. But if it works, and the outcomes which Maureen had set at the beginning of saying these are our success criteria, if they were met, then they were absolutely happy to embed the model, because this is exactly where she wanted to be in terms of the outcomes for young people.
So this is about transformation in services and delivering better outcomes by investing in doing things differently. It's not necessarily preventative spend in all cases, is that fair?
Not necessarily, no. It's about doing, in a sense, that one wasn't about preventative spend, but I suppose long term it is about preventative spend, because if you can change the life trajectory for young people in the care system, that's a huge preventative spend. I mean, I don't need to outline to this committee in terms of what happens to young people in the care system. 50%, I think, at one point when they did a poll of young people in Polmont had been in the care system. You know, that's the kind of trajectory you're trying to prevent. And with education, that's the way you can prevent it. So in a sense, it is preventative, but you wouldn't necessarily have badged it at that. But yes, it does change lives.
Okay, so moving on, you just talked about a good example there. If Glasgow, for example, manages, let's say, for the sake of argument, to transform the lives of young people in care, it is anticipated and highly likely that will reduce the prison population in Polmont. How do you do the accounting on this? Because I've looked at cases where the third sector has run projects principally funded by local government that have been evaluated, and they've saved the police money, they've saved the health service money, they've even saved the local authority money in other service areas. But they've not been able to get that money back, if you like. It seems to me there's a challenge in accounting here. If we're serious about this, there needs to be some balance sheet set up between, for the sake of argument, Glasgow's Education Service and the Scottish Prison Service, that if you can demonstrate a link between what one's doing and an impact on the budget of the other, the money needs to come back. Have you had any thoughts about that kind of change? Because it seems to me that people responsible for delivering services in the public sector are very reluctant to commit sums of money to preventative spend if actually they think that someone else is going to get the financial benefit.
Well, being a chartered accountant, budgets are music to my ears, but this is not actually what drives it. I think that my answer would be it's about leadership, and I think Maureen exhibited it there. I think that it's about sometimes saying, well, what's actually best for the people of Scotland, for what's best for our young people. And Maureen took that difficult decision. And she realised that, in a sense, not all the savings would necessarily come to her, but she wanted to do the right thing. And I think that was great leadership. And I think that's what we need more of in local authorities and in our public services. I do think that this particular model I'm talking about is probably ideal to work within a local authority. Because the local authority has got different budgets. It could be education, it could be social work. So it's easier to move between that. If it becomes to the police, then obviously that's a very different type of discussion. And therefore, I don't think that social bridging finance is necessarily a silver bullet, but it can have a lot of use within the public sector. There is an interesting example, and we make reference to it in our submission. That's about East Renfrewshire, and where we're actually, it's the Health and Social Care Partnership that are actually the partner within this, with Children First, to provide the service there. So it's a mixture of the council and the NHS together, actually funding it through the IJB.
And David, do you have any views on these kind of models?
Yeah, I mean, just to pick up on the point of that shifting the mainstream budgets into where the spend goes, I mean, I think that's a huge challenge because departments are protective of their budgets and they're looking to realise efficiencies or savings with it so that they can spend it themselves. A lot of the time, I think the Audit Scotland evidence on community planning is kind of limited around how the public sector within itself has been able to shift budgets between kind of health and local authorities, police and others. So knocking that onto the third sector is a real challenge. We see that we've recently produced evidence on kind of social prescribing where the health sector is, people that are presenting with long-term conditions are perhaps best served by community, getting involved in local community activity, volunteering, befriending, physical activity. But a lot of the way that these programmes are set up are to invest in the process to prescribe people to the third sector and community groups and projects and save money to the NHS or the public sector. And then those savings then don't flow into the services that are delivering those. They are realised as efficiency savings and not passed on. And that means those services and communities are not sustainable. So that shifting of money around the system, I think there's limited evidence of how that's happening effectively. Leadership is pretty crucial to that. So there's a lot of work to do on systems thinking. These issues that we're tackling, if we're going to meet the national outcomes that that Scotland set up to achieve, the Sustainable Development Goals as well, we need to think about the systems and an ecosystem at a local level, not individual departments or services and their own budgets.
And can I just ask how community planning fits into all of this? I mean, that was meant to be a framework within which not only could communities be a little bit more empowered, but services could be better designed, etc. Has that had any impact in your thinking? I mean, I'm particularly interested in whether the Robertson Trust had any views on that or any insights into that from the work
I think it's been very mixed, what we've seen, that they have worked to varying degrees across Scotland. Some have worked very well and others have not worked well at all. And it's very difficult to generalise on it. It has been a very varied picture, is our experience. So I don't know if you'd agree, David.
I think I would agree, and it comes down potentially to kind of people and leadership, not necessarily the kind of frameworks or legislation that are there.
And David and Mara, you both talked about efficiency savings. David, you've just talked about an example where efficiency savings were achieved, but the outcomes weren't. But surely an efficiency is about doing the same or more with less resources. It's not actually about cuts. And earlier you were suggesting that some efficiencies that local government are reporting are not actually efficiencies.
Well, excuse me, I think it's a matter of terminology. I think we've got to the point where most of the efficiencies that you could possibly identify in the system have been identified and have been achieved. And that notion of doing less with more has resulted, now we're at the point where... Sorry.
Yes.
Thanks for the correction. Doing more with less sometimes feels the other way. No. You've got a situation because of, we'll go back again to the salami slicing scenario, where you've got less people working in departments. Roads is a good example. We recently done a survey of members that work in roads teams. So year on year, budgets are reduced, people are reduced, but the amount of work hasn't reduced. In fact, it has increased. People are more likely to complain about the state of the roads and pavements now, so there's an extra workload there. So what you're getting is immense pressure on our members that are working in local authorities in situations like that, where there are less people to do the work, there's more work to be done. The morale is rock bottom because they've just suffered, they've sat through years and years and years of seeing their colleagues disappear. The people who have left are the ones with the most experience. There's hardly anybody over aged 55 working in some sections in local government now, and there are no new people coming in to replace them. So, you know, if you're aged between 40 and 55, you're it in local government. There's nobody, you know, coming up through the ranks because all those jobs that the 55 to 65-year-olds have been deleted, they're gone. It's not as if people are retiring and being replaced. So you're losing experience at one end, and you're losing, for want of a better term, youth and vitality at the other end. You're coming up to help us old people sitting in that middle bit. But people are really feeling the strain out there. They're doing much. They're covering for the working people who have left. Those people aren't being replaced. The work-related stress, in my experience, has gone through the roof. Work-related stress absence also is a major problem in some places in local authorities, and that's all down to the fact that people are working longer hours, unpaid hours. They're working through their breaks. They don't take breaks, and because they want to provide a service to their community, it's having massive strain on people.
So is there a lesson there about either delivering efficiencies or designing and delivering services differently, that the people who are responsible on the ground for delivering those services need to be better part of the process of redesign? Is that something you're suggesting there? Because you seem to be implying that overall in accounting terms there is an efficiency, but the people who are actually delivering it are finding themselves working more, so they're not.
Well, does that produce? What I'm saying is we've got to the point where it no longer is about achieving efficiencies. What you're doing here is making cuts, but you're making cuts in the amount of people who are delivering the services, but expecting the same or higher levels of service to be delivered. And because we spoke earlier about the increase in demand for especially lower income groups of service users, the demand increases, and the number of people available to deliver the services, no matter how they're configured, continues to drop. So you get to a point where it doesn't work anymore. The efficiencies have been achieved, and what you're doing now is damaging services and damaging communities.
Okay, thanks. Maybe we can come in later.
Graham, you wanted to come in on IGBs?
Yeah, certainly, if that's okay, convener. This was really relating to the submission from SCVO, where you talk about health and social care partnerships. This committee's looked at IJBs a number of times and the concerns around them. You can probably all come in on this, but if I just read the paragraph that you sent us, there have been issues with the formation of health and social care partnerships. Despite spending billions of pounds of public money, there's very little oversight of their spending decisions. Their decision-making structures lack transparency, with their rationale for their choice of services not always backed by long-term thinking, something we've already discussed, or a clear desire to achieve the best outcomes for communities. This is of concern to the sector, that's the voluntary sector, who've sometimes found their services pulled despite achieving excellent results. So that's quite hard-hitting stuff. You've obviously got concerns about the way these partnerships are operating. I say we've heard that before, and we've also got these concerns. I wonder if you could expand on that, and you can all come in on that because you're all affected by it.
But can I ask, obviously Mr McNeil's going to be responding first, but can we keep our answers a bit briefer now, because we've still got a fair bit to go through.
I suppose there's probably lots of individual examples, and they're varied across the country. There's some that are good, there are some are bad, but it comes back to that point of transparency on decision making, and the fact that decisions are often seen to be based on cost, not on the services that are needed, or conversations about what priorities are. And then that has not if it's purely based on cost, that kind of knock-on impacts on the services that are delivered, and short-term cuts to projects have resulted in longer term impact to the public sector. And I could give examples of that, and I can follow up if required.
Okay.
Concur. We've seen our experiences, it's very varied. Some are further down the road than others. One of the big things that we've encountered is the difficulty around budgets and about who holds the budget and the clarity around that and about who's got the authorisation to spend. And that has been quite complicated to deal with at times, particularly as a funder. We're coming in and saying, we will do this if you do that, and trying to find if there's an ability to match our funding.
And you've found difficulties there?
Yes, but it's not universal. It varies across the country.
Okay.
I think we would, agree that there are difficulties across the board. Excuse me. From our point of view, just a small example, the difficulties that the IGBs cause for our members is the imbalance in the partnership. So local authorities and people working in local authorities feel that they're very much the junior partner in the health and social care partnership. And so, for example, we go back to saving money again and budget cuts. The NHS has a no redundancies policy that means that then if there are cuts within that IGB, that those redundancies are achieved by laying off people who work for a local authority. So it's having a more an imbalanced effect on social workers and people who work in social work in local authorities, because those jobs and those services that are non-statutory are more vulnerable than their equivalents within the NHS.
Can I just clarify that? Sure. You're saying within an IGB then, if there has to be redundancies within that, has to come from the local authority section?
Yes, that's correct. So
do you have examples of that you could send to us? Because that's that's a really interesting piece of information I hadn't realised.
I mean, when they're looking at what the budget for next year is going to be and what the shortfall is going to be there, because there is a no redundancy policy within NHS, then it's a no-go area. You can't reduce the number of staff within an area there. So the local authority
has to look at that.
Takes that. Yeah,
that'd be really helpful.
Depend on whether the council involved also had that policy. Some of them still do.
Most councils have a no compulsory redundancy policy, policy. And but NHS has a no redundancy at all.
No redundancy at all.
No, so you can't achieve savings by people taking voluntary redundancy in NHS.
Yeah. Sorry, you want to come back in, because if not, I've got a question.
I know you want to move on, convener. Just one follow-up, really for yourself, Mr. Ferguson, because you're an accountant, and it's just this lack of transparency over budgets. How do we sort that out? Health and social care partnerships, they're meant to be partnerships. They don't appear to be. It appears the power seems to lie with the NHS rather than councils. How do we sort out this transparency business on budgets?
I'm sorry, I don't have an answer.
You don't have an answer? Oh, well. Can but hope.
We were relying on you.
Failed again.
Some accountant.
Can I just ask Mr McNeill very briefly? I'm sorry, I had started your questioning by saying if you could keep it short, and so you decided to keep it really short, and I do appreciate that. But you say that it has a knock-on impact in the third sector. Would that be because the two bodies haven't joined particularly well, and therefore they haven't been able to get things in place to trickle down or to trickle out to the third sector, or what?
It varies, but I think it's that confusion about responsibility, about transparency, about decision making, and that feeling that decisions are made on cost, not quality of service and priorities. And actually, it's okay to decommission a service or stop funding something because it's not a priority or it's not a quality. But those conversations don't happen. It's based on cutting. Because
still too busy finding their own place before they started dealing with the third sector.
That could be. I mean, the power imbalance is large, and the third sector bear a lot of the risk and are often informed of decisions at the very last minute, and that has knock-on impacts on their staff and the workforce.
Okay, right. Thanks very much for that. Alexander?
Thank you, Convener. Panel, this morning you've given us a very enlightening view of where we really are, or where you believe we are in tackling local government and the sectors you work for. Your written evidence also gave us very strong views about how things are working or not working. We've touched on you're having to do more with less. You've given some examples today about spends to save that's happened across some councils. But there's also the idea that we may have a crisis here, that we're facing a crisis. You've given views and opinions about how that is the lack of workforce, the removal of specific services, the change that councils have had to adapt to try and manage all that. So do you believe that at this stage that there are any more efficiencies that could be managed? And if there are, how could they and how are they improving the service delivery for individuals and service users in today's situation?
Your response will be fairly short here, I'm sure, so if you want to kick off. Yes.
I think the model's broken. I really do. I think that the model of particularly working with the third sector is broken. I think it plays to nobody's strength. And as I mentioned before, it's a race to the bottom. And one of your questions was, what do I see in 20 years? And if you keep going with this kind of model, I see a vastly reduced charity sector, and I just can't see it working. I think there are new paradigms. I think there's new ways of doing it. I think there's new ways of working, and hopefully we've alluded to that. I think it's around partnership, and it's about a different approach. I think it's about long-term as well. I think there's far too much short-termism in everything we do, and it's coming back to Mr. Simpson's point about finance. I would say that in no business would you do things on a one-year cycle or invest on a one-year cycle. You look forward and you invest for the long term. And I think we need to get that kind of mindset within the public sector and within our finances, our public finances. And I think, if we could look at that and look into actually say, how can we start to be strategic? Then we can start to do things with the right lens, and we can start to then invest in the things which are preventative, and we can then start to move that big oil tanker in a different direction.
Money. Okay. So, taking that further, the priorities of the Scottish Government, and they have partnership working, they have the community empowerment. All of these are aims and ambitions that you want to be involved in as well, because you see that benefiting, as I say, the communities and service users. But if you don't have the resource and you don't have the manpower, how can you square that circle?
To my social bridging finance model. I'm not a snake oil salesman. It's not the only model. There's other ways of doing things, but I would say that's a way of looking at how do we bring new money to take a risk, and to take a risk. I've always described philanthropy as the flea on the back of an elephant, because we can only ever provide that against the public sector budgets that are this. But we can take a risk with that, and we can do things which are fleet of foot, that we can do things that no one else will, because we're not looking for a financial return, we're looking for a social impact, we're looking for a change in our society. And therefore we're prepared to risk our money in ways which other people wouldn't. And I think that that's a key thing, and I think it's a part of the equation that's maybe been overlooked. And I think that the philanthropists and the trusts and the foundations are willing to step up, but they want a partnership. It's not, we'll come to you to subsidise cuts. That isn't a partnership. That's a subsidy. And therefore, what we are looking for is a different way of doing things. And I think that we could rise to that challenge. And we are looking for that challenge from government to say, how can you work better with us? And I think that a lot of the philanthropists and philanthropic money in Scotland, and broader field, if I could say, I sit on a board of a national UK organisation representing 350 philanthropic foundations, representing nearly £2.6 billion of spending per year. And they are amazed at the opportunities in Scotland for partnership. And I think this is something that we could really build on, is that idea of partnership between government, between local authorities and philanthropic and charities, because there's a great opportunity in Scotland I don't see in other countries.
And you identify it seems to be being missed here in Scotland to some degree about what is being, and there needs to be much wider communication, a much better campaign, a much better understanding of how you can attract that kind of investment, how you can attract that kind of support mechanism to ensure that you can benefit from it.
I think it's being missed. I just don't think we're maximising it.
Okay.
I think there's a lot more we could do, a lot more we could do with charities, a lot more we could do with philanthropy money as well, and I think a lot more we could do with the public sector itself and changing attitudes within that and a willingness to work with us.
Yeah. And Ms Kendall, your views on that? You've got some strong views about how that should work?
It is about the model. I mean, I think there's no doubt more money, you know, is always useful and needed if we're going to meet all of the outcomes that we want to achieve. That's not always possible. And back to the kind of a point I think I opened with, it's about a lot of the process and a change to systems thinking, to the ability to take to risks, to have relationships, to not have that race to the bottom in procurement. I think in an acknowledging the role that different models can play in bringing in external funding. I think the Edinburgh, and valuing the work that's going on in communities. I think just here in Edinburgh, the Edinburgh Voluntary Organisations Council, they showed that for every £1 in public funding, the sector brought in £8 come in, and they employ more people than the finance sector. But the finance sector is seen as more, they're about the economy, not well-being, and that is even though we talk about inclusive growth, and the economy is what we measure, not kind of always well-being.
I mean, councils have had to deal with service-level agreements, and that has been a success to some extent when you're trying to partnership and try and create that model or that new model. But what would you like to see extended from that service-level agreement that would enhance, that would support the council and employees that are working in the sector and supporting it in the council side?
I think across the board, it's about investment in people, and it's about investing in the skills and talents and the people in the third sector organisations, but also within the local authorities. Partnerships work because people speak to each other and people work together, you know, and the local authority, from our point of view, has to be the employer of choice in the marketplace. We're losing, as I described earlier, like, you know, skills and talents and experienced people, and I'm sure your organisations are finding the same thing. If you're a town planner, or if you're a surveyor, you're going to get much better paying conditions working in the private sector, and it's the same across the board. So we're getting to a point where local authorities and also our partner organisations can only employ people in temporary contracts, and that has a massive impact on the sort of people that you can attract in organisations. So I think long-term planning, investing in people, makes partnerships work.
Thank you very much. Annabelle?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. I think we've had a very interesting discussion, and obviously it's been quite wide-ranging, and some of the issues I was going to address particularly have been asked and answered. But looking to some wider issues, so we've talked about third sector involvement. I suppose a key question is, and this would be directed in particular to Mr Ferguson and Mr McNeill, what do you see as the capacity of the third sector to do all the good things that you have outlined? Do you have the capacity, do you think, at this stage?
After you.
There is lots of capacity in communities. I think the flows, and there's lots of assets in communities. It's how to maximise those. I think there is challenge around money and how it flows that we've already talked about. But these needs arise in communities because and organisations respond because there is a need. There's a gap that's not being met, and money springs up. Sometimes those needs are resolved, and actually organisations can close, and it's okay for organisations to close if things have been addressed. But there is a capacity issue that we need to invest in, and I think that's not just the public sector. I don't think the third sector expect solutions to come from central government or local government. I think they expect this to be a partnership, and there's roles and responsibilities on either side.
I think there's great latent capacity. I think that the model that we've seen, as I was saying, I think is broken. I don't think we can go on with that. And yet, within that, I still see immensely motivated and committed people within the sector. And I think that there's a huge potential. And if that was in some way recognised and that was given a green light, I think we could see a huge increase in capacity just by the willingness of people to be involved. I think the other thing is in terms of David's comment about communities. I think too often we see our communities in terms of negative and deficit. And I think that there's a huge amount of asset in our communities. And I really worry about what's happening to Civic Scotland and about that loss of that asset, because it is a huge asset. And a lot of the time it doesn't want to be paid. It just wants to go and do good. And I think there's a huge part of our culture is about doing good. I mean, we are a kind and compassionate country. We're one of the most charitable countries in the world in terms of our giving. And I think, you know, that is how do you tap into that and how do you get that encouraged and how do you try and build on that? And I think that there are ways of doing that. And I think that that is where the potential can come. But I think it has to come from the whole environment. The environment has to change, because at the moment it's everyone is playing to their deficit and rather than playing to their strength, which is a real shame.
Thank you. That's a very interesting topic, I think, for a discussion all on its own. But I agree. I think it's great when you can see resilient communities that are indeed using their strengths and building on what they have. And in my own constituency, for example, we see a community cinema in Kelty, which is quite recent. We see in Cowdenbeath the first 5K fun run just a month ago or so, and other community activities. And I think that's really, really important. And it is to recognise that there are assets in every community in Scotland, but it is the how. How do we harness that? And taking a point, an important point that that Marie raised in her paper, and she said at paragraph 11, suggesting that the solution to budget cuts are through shared services, joint working collaboratives and regional and national decision making will continue to move decision making even further from communities. And it would be interesting, I'm going to come to Marie in a minute, it would be interesting just to see what you both felt, if you feel that that is necessarily the logical follow-on from greater joint working, in this case with third sector, shared services. Is it a sine qua non that would mean less community moving decisions further away from local communities? Because it seems to me that unless we get out of a kind of silo mentality and look in the totality at improving the lives of our citizens, wherever they happen to be, we're going to struggle to see the promised land. But on that specific point, which I think it's a fair point for Marie to raise, the importance of democracy and local decision making, do you feel that greater third sector joint working would diminish that?
I think I would encourage, because we're a great believer in grassroots, we're a great believer in user voice, a great believer in people know best. And top-down tends not to work. Bottom-up is often the solution. And I think that what Marie, I hope I'm not speaking for you on this, Marie, but it feels like you're saying about top-down initiatives don't work. You've got to have it, in a sense, coming from the community. And we would always encourage things which were in the community, because at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to support, is often community-type organisations and people who've come together with a passion to make a change.
And I suppose there are opportunities to do things across kind of boundaries and across geographies and kind of nationally where appropriate. You know, if we're buying widgets, then why not buy them once for Scotland, you know, than 32 times or whatever. But when we're dealing with people and the complex outcomes that we're trying to achieve, decisions on that and the priorities often need to go as low as possible in communities. And there are assets there that we can use to engage communities.
In our experience, top-down services are expensive, and services that are driven and resourced and identified by communities are tailor-made, and you get them right first time, and you don't have to go reinventing the wheel all the time. They're exactly right for exactly the circumstances that are needed. And I was interested in you talking about kind of the deficit model of, we've slid into this way of thinking that we as local authorities or as government or as third sector organisations are out there to fix issues in communities, whereas if you look at it the other way about the community asset model, the answers in the people is already there. And if you take efficiencies of scale and you apply that to interactions with people in communities, you miss that. You miss the opportunity to get it right the first time, and you miss the opportunity to engage with the people in that community that can help you make a difference.
Thank you for that. And it is obviously to the benefit of all projects and our citizens that they feel empowered and engaged in whatever the issue is. And in that regard, I was struck by, I think it was in the SVO paper, where you were providing, Ms McNeill was providing good examples of activity undertaken by the third sector, some of which has been touched upon already. But one was the West Lothian food train, which I had heard about in any event. It seems a very successful venture. And the point was made, and I think very importantly made, that West Lothian has a very active seniors forum supported by the Health and Social Care Partnership as part of the work that is ongoing in terms of joining up in health and social care. And I just thought that was a really important point to make. So it seemed to me to suggest that there's light at the end of the tunnel, that indeed there are some good practice areas for IGB, and I just wish that the good practice could be shared more widely. And also that it is not incompatible with the IGB model to have this absolute direct engagement from people directly affected, in this case the Seniors Forum in West Lothian. And maybe you'd like to comment on that in particular, or the generality of that comment.
Yeah, and the food train is a great example of lots of realising assets in communities, because it's about bringing volunteers into people's homes to provide them with food. But actually, there's a nutritional benefit there, which might be the objective. But actually, it's social. It's reducing social isolation. It's building relationships in communities, and when you think about it as reducing a kind of food delivery service, that's not what it's achieving. It's achieving a lot more outcomes than that. And I know they have struggled across IJBs. Some have been they've been decommissioned, and I think in North Ayrshire was one example where their service funding was withdrawn, and in a few weeks, two of the people that they worked with had to go into residential care, costing the public sector more than the service that was provided. So, and the West Lothian example is a great example of it if it actually working, and they're rolling out in other areas. So it's the variance across the country and that decision-making process that's a challenge.
Thank you for that. I mean, as I say, it just seems to me that when we're looking at, we have the issue of IGBs comes up quite a lot, but in broad brush, in terms of engagement across public sector for local service provision, that if you can have a situation where you have a functioning forum for local engagement, for community engagement, which I think everybody agrees is extremely important for all this to work, then that gives us hope that whatever is happening here in West Lothian, can be replicated hopefully by authorities across Scotland to ensure that these very important projects, including health and social care partnerships, can actually function. Because if they don't function, it is an impact perhaps on staff, as Mary said, but it's an impact on every single person in that community if it doesn't function. So we have the obligation to get it functioning, and that should involve everybody who's got something to bring to the table, including the third sector. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. Very interesting that when Annabelle was talking about light at the end of the tunnel, she was talking about a food train. That's highly encouraging. I'd like to go back to something that you said, Mr. Ferguson. You mentioned that the philanthropists you were talking about through the UK said that there was better opportunities or huge opportunities in Scotland to use their money. What did you mean by that? Why did you think there's better opportunities in Scotland, and how can we then encourage them to come and use that money wisely?
I think that there are benefits of being a smaller country. We are actually a progressive country in terms of our policies. We're seen to be progressive. And this is not a political statement when I say this, but access to politicians and to ministers is easier in Scotland. I know that when I sit on the board in London and I talk of my conversations with ministers, they're absolutely blown away because they cannot even get to meet ministers down south. And so there's a real feeling of distance from power, and also I would say there's a different attitude. And dare I say it, I think your invitation to us to come to speak today is part of that different attitude, a willingness to hear about the third sector and about the role that it can play and about the role that philanthropy and philanthropic funds can actually play within it. A lot of the funders that I speak about are big London-based funds, and they have a remit across the UK, and they often feel underrepresented in Scotland because they know it's different, and it's a different jurisdiction, different ways of working, and they're very keen to come and learn. And when I tell them about the kind of things that we're able to do here and some of the progressive policies that we have, they're really keen to see if they can sandbox and perhaps fund something here in Scotland, which they can then use as an exemplar to take south and try and land in other parts of the UK. So I think there's a huge opportunity for that. There's a big appetite for them to come and learn, because I think that they are stymied south of the border in terms of getting access to change and access to public systems to actually see change within them. And I think in Scotland we have an appetite and we have a willingness to look at it.
We get them here. They've got all that money, can't get to spend it down south. Yeah. We can help them as much as possible. Invite them
and show them what we do. And it's literally down to that. We've had several visits from, we continually host foundations from the south and introduce them to key decision makers within Scotland. And I think we could do a lot more of it. And I think we could do it on a more formal basis.
Yeah. Okay, listen, thanks very much for that. We're just going to finish off. Sarah's got a question.
It's a brief supplementary. We've spent quite a lot of time thinking about preventative spend in terms of people, demographics and social justice. You'll have clocked last week we went through stage 3 of the climate change bill, which puts quite a strong emphasis on investment in infrastructure and changing service delivery. And it was highlighted in the Unison submission about how we reduce our carbon footprint and how we invest in, you gave 2 examples, heat and power and low carbon transport. How is that going to happen in terms of the national performance framework with the climate of reduced expenditure coming to local government, where you've got to totally change what needs to be done? And I think there was a good point you made about leadership and about the concept of R&D coming from out with local government and then being utilised. When we're talking about something that it's not really new, but there's a much stronger focus on it, how is local government going to respond, and the different perspectives you've got in terms of R&D, service delivery, and how do you change in local authorities in terms of leadership?
I think it's about strategic thinking, being able to look in the future. It's also about leadership, but I think most importantly it's about ambition for local authorities and for communities. Things like shared hating schemes are schemes that are obviously going to have an impact on the carbon footprint. Things as well like sustainable transport. All of these things need investment. Local authorities can't just deal with that within existing budgets, I don't think. So it's about what we spoke about earlier. It's about, again, it's a measure of preventative. It's about investing in the future for the communities. So and leadership, I think is important also, because that provides ambition for local authorities. And again, it goes back to, are we looking at our communities in a deficit model, or are we looking at ambition, and are we looking at the assets that are already there? We have to build these solutions. We have to use local authorities as the interface between communities and what can be achieved, and as a way of achieving it. So I think in terms of climate change and what can be achieved locally on the ground, it needs leadership, it needs investment, and it needs ambition.
The other 2 witnesses, any comments?
I suppose I'll bring up a completely non-strategic example and very kind of specific. I been involved in a lot of work on digital transformation across sectors, and looking at kind of reducing kind of travel and footprint. And all the transformation of service, whether digital or otherwise, is all about people and the culture. And one very specific example was introducing technology in a service to allow people to conference remotely and into video conferencing rather than travelling in a large rural area. But they persisted in maintaining meetings and coming to meetings. And the reason was they were paid mileage to come to the meetings. Now, we can have enabling environments, we can have the right technology, we can have the right tools, we can have the willingness, but actually there's culture and behaviours that are embedded in changing what people do. So whether it's about transport, whether it's about waste, whether that's staff, workforce, it's communities, it's hard to change people's behaviours, and that cultural change is a fundamental building block.
I would just reiterate the point I made earlier about the flea and the elephant, because I think in terms of infrastructure, I don't think that's necessarily something that we as a sector can bring to the party. I think that's something for government and for local authorities where they have that scale to be able to bring infrastructure to it. But I do think that we can bring people, and I think that we can bring communities. And it's very interesting because there was a piece of research done recently about environmental funding in Scotland, and it turned out the Robertson Trust was the largest environmental funder, and we have no strategic thread which actually says we will fund the environment. And it's all our funding was going to work with people and using the environment to change their situation. You talked about social prescribing. It's exactly that. It's where the environment and the outdoors are used in a way which is to the benefit of people and changing them. And I thought that was a really interesting thing, that actually sometimes we look at the lens around environment from just the environment, but actually it's the interaction of people with that. And I think the sector has a huge part to play in that and can really influence and change attitudes as well around that.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, and that's a good note to finish on. Can I just thank the panel for attending today's session? It was a very, very useful evidence session for us. A further session will take place on the 9th of October, and that concludes the public part of today's meeting. Thank you very much.